When I was trying to figure out what to do for this, I thought, one of the things that always comes to mind is, how do you preserve things that are too big to preserve? Coupled with the fact that a lot of things I photograph, like on Cape Canaveral, are on prime real estate for launching things, that if you try to preserve all the historic sites, there won't be any room left to launch anything. So I wanted to talk about 3 different launch pads on Cape Canaveral, and actually Kennedy Space Center as well, that I had experiences in a different way, where I was able to photograph them before, in some cases during, and then after their demolition. And just get into what this entails, and maybe spur some of you to come up with other ideas besides just photographing them, which is what I do. So the first complex is Launch Complex 13, which is also known as Complex X, because they launched a lot of National Reconnaissance Office and other secret missions from there that are still classified. And to limit people from understanding which launch pad was being used, they would refer to it as Complex X. Just not that it fooled that many people probably, but they felt better about it. And this, when I started photographing on Cape Canaveral in 1990, this was the most complete launch complex in existence. It really had pretty much everything, and it was in really good shape, relatively speaking. It hadn't been used in probably over 20 years at that point. But we could climb up the mobile service tower. We could go everywhere, in the buildings, underground in some cases, and it was perfectly fine. Over time, and I photographed this complex for 25 years, it started to deteriorate, and the stairways collapsed, and they fenced it off, and you couldn't get near it, and they eventually demolished it. When I approach my work with these historic space complexes or vehicles or whatever it might be, I'm always working in this odd combined documentary and abstract approach. And most of what you're going to see today is documentary, but I wanted to start out with a couple of the more abstract images, which are also documents because they show the detail of these. So that, like the bolts on that's one of the bolts holding down the launch umbilical tower. They're about that big. They're huge. Here's the gantry control booth where they would operate the gantry from and pull it away from the mobile service tower is the more current term for them. They could move it away from the launch pad before the launch. And I'm trained not as a historian, not as an archaeologist, not as an engineer, but as a photographer, as an artist really. So I was always looking at the light and the color and the things that I thought would make pleasing images, along with documenting the history and what was left at this point in the lives of these facilities. So this is the base of the mobile service tower when they were about to demolish it. So they had cut away a lot of the metal structure. They had already moved the launch umbilical tower. Here, this is a comparison. So on the left is just a close-up of that other photograph. And you can see that they've cut all this out. There's weird little, I don't know if you can see them this, but there's like ladders tied up so they could get up to the higher areas. And where it's gray right there is where they were going to put the explosives in. This was just a couple days before they took this pad down. And here's the actual implosion. Now, I photographed this from the top of the blockhouse at Complex 34, which wasn't that far away, and we actually felt the concussive blast because we were about the same level as most of those explosions. It was kind of a sad experience for me because I'd been photographing this pad for 25 years, as I said. There had at one point been a proposal that they turn this into a tourist site so that they preserve it, restore it, but at the time, I believe the estimated cost for restoring it to where the public could access it was about $10 million, and then it would cost about $2 million a year just to maintain it because these pads are all built right on the ocean. It's the hot Florida sun, the paint oxidizes, the steel rusts. So it's kind of the worst environment for protecting any kind of steel structure. And the way they take these down is the mobile service towers are broader at the bottom, so they kind of make them kneel down. they'll take, whoops, oh, I'm hitting the wrong button, sorry about that. Getting ahead of myself, come on back. They break the wide part and then the tower starts to lean, then they blow it again and the whole rest of the tower. The goal is to get the tower down to where they can just cut it up with these machines that come in with it that just tear it to pieces. And they took this tower down because they realized that it was painted with lead paint and even for some unknown reason to me, paint that contained PCBs. And it was oxidizing. It had been there for over 30 years at that point. Oxidizing, contaminating the soil. They had to spend quite a bit of money to remediate the soil from that contamination. So they took it down and that was it. And so then they realized, well, when we end a program, we better take those things down right away so we're not spending that kind of money remediating the soil. So that's one of the issues with preserving these. Besides, you can't, there's several things. Number one, it's on basically a top secret military base where you can't just let people run around. Number two, you can't build a building around it because it's a building itself. And then the costs of maintaining it, the costs of dealing with the environmental issues. But this was a path that I was able to follow for a long time. Once they took this down, as I said, then they realized, well, we have to take them down as soon as we can. So then as they ended programs, they would blow the pads up in a couple of years. Complex 36 was a twin launch pad complex where they launched Atlas rockets, and they missions like Mariner, some of the other deep space missions were launched from there. So it's very historic, as was 13. 13, they launched the lunar orbiter missions that mapped the landing locations for the moon. But Complex 36 was active until 2005. So I couldn't get out there and photograph. So I couldn't even take pictures from a distance. They didn't want you doing that even. But as soon as they shut it down, I got out there and started photographing it. So again, here's a couple of the more abstract things. And this was taken actually after they blew it up. This is in 2008. And this is looking at the doors on the mobile service tower. And that little opening is where the umbilicals would run through to the umbilical tower. But I also would photograph the overall site. So here you see I'm viewing a pad 36B from the tower on 36A, and you see the Cape Canaveral lighthouse off in the distance. So you get a little bit of an idea of the layout of it. And this is looking down at the blockhouse from the same vantage point. And these blockhouses were kind of uniform there in that part of the Cape. I'm not sure if this was built like the original ones, but I got kind of a side view of these just to give you an idea of how they're made. So this area right here, you see this arch, that's 5 feet of cement. This is 10 feet of sand, then with more cement on top of it. So they were designed to have things blow up and land on them, which they did on occasion, hopefully with very little drama. And my one escort that I had a lot out there, a gentleman named Johnny Johnson, who was the deputy base commander, which is the civilian position. Basically, he was in charge of facilities. He wanted them to, after that last Atlas launch from 36, he wanted them to literally like chain the blockhouse doors shut and just leave it and just lock it up. Because if you notice now, people, you see SpaceX launches, they're all sitting in these rooms with big glass windows. You don't need to be a few hundred yards from the launch pad to launch stuff. You can be miles and miles and miles away, which is much safer. But this was the last blockhouse that was ever used. And so here they've already started taking some of the equipment out of it. You can see where some of the consoles were. Very unique lighting and interesting. And this is actually on the second floor. There's 2 stories to these blockhouses. And I started photographing some of the details, and there are things I find even, I don't really see them when I'm photographing. So this is the payload console in there. And in looking at the image, I'm going to show you a little detail of this little terminal here. And these are the kind of things that I find fascinating when I'm doing this work that I think they tend to get lost, because on that little sticker up there it says, note PC date set 10 years prior to current date for Y2K resolution. Meaning they never did any kind of Y2K update. They just set their computer date back 10 years, and they're launching $100 million payloads off this launch pad. Now, they only did it for 5 years, but I just find that fascinating that there was no quick fix for that. And it's probably the technology that caused that. And then while I was there, I roamed all through it, and I saw these red X's on a lot of the equipment. And what I found out was some of the equipment belonged to the Air Force, and some of the equipment belonged to Lockheed, who was the contractor operating it. And Lockheed, whoever was going to take it over, even though it was very unlikely anyone was going to use a blockhouse again, Lockheed didn't want anybody getting a hold of their materials, even though they couldn't use them again. So they marked them with a red X, and then they just chucked them in a dumpster, just literally threw all that stuff away. And I'm sure there was really some amazing things that would have been great for museums, but this is kind of the way it goes with the corporate world and their competition. Now, Blue Origin is now utilizing this site. And by the way, Complex 13 is now this landing site 1 where they land the boosters, the SpaceX boosters. So both of these sites have been reutilized or are being reutilized for a new purpose, it's hard to argue with that because that's what that real estate on Cape Canaveral is great for. This is the one of the periscopes. I think there were 4 periscopes, so they could watch the launch through these periscopes. One of the funny things was they would, as is often the case, people would put shoe polish on the rubber, and I actually found some one time on one of them, just to mess with people that looked through them. And then, again, there's these little stories that you find that I think get lost and get overlooked, and they're not a major point to our history of space, but I think they do allude to some larger things. So here's one of the consoles they've torn apart. This is actually the plug board where they would wire these together to actually command the rockets. But that little piece of paper in there is the launch prayer. Now, I have nothing against prayer, but I thought it was really interesting that I didn't know that they did this until I saw that. I had no idea they said a prayer before they launched a rocket. And this is, well, it's Lockheed, I guess, and or the Air Force. But my favorite part is right here. Though we may be challenged by the forecast, which calls for 80% chance of weather violation, we are not discouraged. We march forward with confidence, realizing from past experiences that Florida weather can change from one moment to another, which is very specific in the prayer. I just thought that was very interesting. But they launched that day, so maybe it works. Who knows? And then here's this rotary. I shot this, I think, in 2005. It's a rotary dial telephone, and it's plugged in. If you follow the wire, it actually runs back in here. I don't know why. I guess it goes along with the Y2K stuff, but I don't. By that point, phone systems were digital. They'd been digital for years, and rotary phones wouldn't even work. So I'm not sure. I'm sure it had something to do that they had to have that old technology, and that's one of the things that I'm struck by over and over with these old facilities is there's some really amazing high-tech stuff, and there's some really like stone knives and bear skins type stuff, and it's just the way it evolves. So to give you an idea of how they take these pads down, I got to go out while they had the explosives in one of the towers at pad 36, and they cut out these openings, they cut it through, they don't cut the cross members, but this is the explosive, and this is a primer, and this is detonation cord, and they're different colors, I think because they burn at different rates or explode at different rates, so they can time the explosions differently. And then when the explosives go off, it fractures the rest of that beam, and this is the result. And again, you see how they kneeled it over first, and then they blew the top part off. And again, with this, I found just to show you the carnage of this, how much damage that does. But then I saw this, and there's this little sign hanging like this. It says danger explosives installed, just in case you can't see it. And now that wasn't because of the explosion. That was something probably when they put the self-destruct charges in, they had to, but these little, they just happened to, that door fell off and those signs flipped up like that. And then I found this. I didn't set these up, but I like the self-commentary by the launch tower of itself. So, you know, this is part of the reason I do this, because I think it speaks to the technology and speaks to some extent, to the loss of these amazing facilities where so much history took place. And this is the before shot looking up at all the different platforms that would go around the rocket. And that's the aftermath. And by the way, while I was, I was able to go in just a few hours after they took it down. And then, like later on, they found out there was a bunch of ordnance that didn't go off. Now, the ordnance takes a very specific, intense charge to be detonated, but it was a little creepy to realize that we'd been walking around all this stuff. And then Launch Complex 39. Now, this is really, the shuttle, not really part of the race to space at that point. But, of course, Launch Complex 39, both at Pad A and B, were used in the Apollo program initially. And buried beneath the concrete superstructure of the pad is a place known as the rubber room. And the rubber room is actually this part of this image. And from the too many acronyms, the mobile transporter where the Apollo rocket would sit, that's rolled out on the crawler, there was an opening. It was a tube. You could, if there was bad stuff happening, you could jump in that tube, slide down through the base of the pad, and end up in the rubber room, which was literally a rubber wall, a big rubber slide, and rubber at the end of the wall. And I'd heard about this from students when I was teaching at the college down there when I first started, and it was like lore. It was like, you've got to get to the rubber. Well, no one gets to the rubber room. So I was able to get into one, and then right before they were going to hand the pad, this is Pad A, hand it off to SpaceX, I actually got contacted by NASA. They said, look, we're going to lose access to this. If you want to come down and photograph, you better do this now. So I got in. I think a few other people got in as well. But this is a big blast door. So the astronauts could, or workers, or whoever it was, could hide out in this room. And I like to think that there were cushions on these chairs, but these chairs have seat belts. And the reason is this floor is isolated from the walls, and it's on giant springs, so that if the place was rocking and rolling, allegedly you'd be damped a little bit from all that shaking. And they had an oxygen generator and food and water, I think for about 3 days in there. And there was also an escape tunnel that went out past the pad perimeter, if it was okay to get out that way. So it was actually not just a place to shelter, but you could actually get away as well. Thankfully, they never had to use it. Again, I like photographing the kind of the abstract stuff that's always a part of this. This is looking up at the first one was the fire bricks. This is looking up at from below the mobile launch platform. So you see at this point, of course, it's space shuttle. So this was the opening for the main engine exhaust and the two solid rocket boosters. And here's an overall shot of the pad. And I showed a couple of these last year, I believe. But this is them taking the pad down, and they have giant crane, of course, and this is a really interesting piece of equipment that, much like in that other photo I showed, it grabs and they just twist the metal and rip it off and took it all down. They did save the beanie cap from this that covered up the top of the external tank where they were collecting the gases that were venting out of the tank as they filled it. And that's in the Kennedy Space Center Visitor Center. And previously, they had saved the Apollo launch umbilical tower, which had been cut up into sections. They eventually scrapped most of that, but they kept the top two levels, and those are in the Saturn V Center at the Kennedy Space Center. And so I just wanted to kind of talk about the fact that, these sites are hard to preserve, A, because they're so big, B, because it's so expensive, and C, because it's such prime real estate. Now, one of the sites they're proposing to launch the Starship from, SpaceX's Starship on Cape Canaveral, is Complex 37, which was the Delta IV and Delta IV Heavy launch site, which they just had the last launch from. It is right next to Complex 34, and Complex 34 is the site of the launch of Apollo 7, Saturn 1B, and the tragic Apollo 1 fire. And so I have a great concern that if they drop one of those starships on Pad 34, they'll destroy it. It's a very kind of spiritual place. And so much like preserving the moon from other damage from other missions, I think there need to be some thought to what do we do with a few of those sites. I think Complex 34, I don't think they'll ever build anything on Complex 34, but it makes me a little nervous. And they haven't decided where those are going to launch from, but it's something to think about. So, thank you.